I stepped onto the cold stone floor of the Denver courtroom, 29 years old, feeling every single stare. My father, looking exhausted, hid behind the defense table, but it was her, my stepmother, in her perfect cream silk, acting like this was just a tedious appointment. The prosecutor leaned in, her voice low. Today we play the secret tape from the mountain cabin, the one she has no idea exists. It was about much more than those beatings every night. The air in the courtroom was a dense, stagnant thing, heavy with cheap cologne, stale coffee, and the electric hum of 1,000 eyes focused on one spot. That spot was me, Lillian Martin, 29 years old, walking across the marble floor of the central Denver courthouse. My heels clicked a solitary rhythm that seemed amplified 100 times in the cavernous room, each step carrying the weight of 3 years of silence, fear, and methodical investigation. I was dressed in a charcoal suit, Malik's choice, something designed to be neutral, professional, and entirely unyielding. The goal was to look like a survivor, not a victim, and certainly not the unstable, vengeful daughter they would try to paint me as. I felt the familiar, cold knot in my stomach tighten, the one that had lived there since the first bruise. My eyes found him immediately. Daniel Sloan, my father. He sat at the defense table, positioned slightly behind Grant Mercer, his high-powered attorney. Daniel was 61 now, but the man who sat there was a ghost of the magnetic, self-assured logistics mogul I remembered. The dark circles beneath his eyes were not shadows, but proof of sleepless nights, perhaps the first he'd truly experienced since I'd moved out of that house on the outskirts of Denver 3 years prior. His tie was slightly crooked, a tiny, almost imperceptible flaw that would have driven Vivian mad, and his gaze was fixed rigidly on the polished wood in front of him, refusing to meet mine. He was a man consumed by the collateral damage of his own denial. Too late to be a hero, too cowardly to be honest. Beside Mercer, radiating an almost comical degree of calm, sat Vivian Sloan, my stepmother, the defendant. She was magnificent, in the horrifying, calculated way only sociopaths can be. Her suit, a tailored silk crepe in a pale cream color, looked utterly flawless, her posture perfect, her face an expertly constructed mask of serene annoyance. She looked exactly as if she had been dragged away from an afternoon of philanthropy, mildly inconvenienced by the necessity of sitting through this petty family disagreement, rather than facing the potential loss of her freedom. The way she subtly adjusted her pearl necklace, a gift Daniel had given her on their 10th anniversary, one I had helped him pick out, was a calculated show of ownership and disdain. The subtle hint of a smile at the corner of her lips was the most dangerous thing in the room. It said, "You did your best, darling, but I always win." I could feel the heat emanating from the rows reserved for the media, packed tighter than a commuter train. They weren't just journalists, they were the vultures of high society, eager to feast on the downfall of the Sloan name. I heard the low, urgent whispers, a sibilant background noise to the serious business of justice. "Is that the daughter, Lillian Martin?" "The one who reopened the case. Heard she used a private investigator to dig up the original trust fund. The whole thing started with the father's fateful 2-week business trip to Singapore. That's when the nightly stuff began. And the secret multi-million-dollar legacy, the Sloan Heritage Security Trust, that's the real motive here. The abuse is just the drama." They had it mostly right, in the cynical, simplified way the press always did. They saw the money as the motive, not the tool. But the beatings, the verbal assaults, those weren't drama, they were the key. They were the mechanism Vivian used to keep me paralyzed while she executed the financial play, which was worth a sum closer to $8 million, funds Daniel had originally secured for me from his late mother's estate. Marissa Cole, the lead prosecutor, a woman whose face was permanently set in a look of resolute, practical determination, motioned me toward the witness stand. As I walked past her, she paused, tilting her head just enough for me to hear her low voice, completely shielded from the defense. "Keep your eyes only on the jury, Lillian. Remember what we talked about. Today, we play the tape, the one from the Silver Pine Lodge. Mercer is walking into this blind. A surge of cold energy, a mix of terror and exhilarating control, shot through me. The Silver Pine Lodge recording. The voice. Viv's own venomous confession, captured by a cheap app running in my coat pocket, admitting to the minor correction of a few slaps and threatening to bury me in fake medical records. That recording was the single most potent piece of evidence, confirming both the domestic violence and the systematic abuse of power and coercion. We had deliberately held it back, a strategic surprise to circumvent Mercer's planned attacks. My gaze drifted to Grant Mercer, the defense attorney. He caught my eye and offered a thin, practiced, condescending smile. A predator's grin. Mercer was all glossy assurance, the kind of man who sold the moral high ground to the highest bidder. He wore a suit that probably cost $15,000 and had the confident, slightly bored air of someone who knew the system was fundamentally skewed in favor of wealth and clean appearances. His entire defense strategy, I knew, was built on dismantling me. He would use the anonymous, and later proven to be planted, HR reports from my brief suspension at Northline Insight Systems to paint me as emotionally volatile, paranoid, and unreliable. He would characterize my claims of nightly abuse as the paranoid fantasies of a resentful stepdaughter, driven mad by greed for my father's projected 50% stake in the family's total assets, which he would argue was closer to $30 million. Not the much smaller trust fund. He was sure his narrative, the troubled, unstable daughter who wanted to extort her loving stepmother, was winning over the jury. He hadn't counted on the tape. As I settled into the hard wooden chair of the witness stand, adjusting the microphone that suddenly felt gigantic and menacing, the room tilted, and a razor-sharp memory cut through the fluorescent light. It was a flash of that dark, polished hallway at the Denver house. I was 26, fresh out of grad school and temporary, and the air was thick with expectation, the sound of a 22-inch leather Toomey suitcase rolling toward the front door. My father, Daniel, turning back, his face bright with the prospect of the trip. "Just 2 weeks this time, daughter. Promise I'll bring you back something nice from the airport shop." His voice was jovial, full of the easy charm that had always been his default setting. Then the heavy oak door shut with a decisive, echoing clack, the sound of the lock turning. I remembered turning around and seeing Vivian, still standing in the foyer, only 3 feet away. Her face had changed. Instantly, the soft, attentive mask of the loving wife had evaporated, leaving behind something utterly hard and cold, like polished steel reflecting the hallway light. Her eyes, usually warm brown, were suddenly empty and penetrating. She hadn't even waited 10 seconds before delivering the first blow, though it wasn't physical that time. "You know, Lillian," she'd purred, stepping closer. "Now that Daniel's gone, you can finally put away those pathetic data analysis reports. It's unsightly to see a young woman begging for validation in her father's home." The shift was so jarring, so complete. It was like watching a demonic possession, and that was how it began. Not with violence, but with a total, systematic deconstruction of my dignity, paving the way for the physical pain. The memory was visceral, making my hands clench until my nails bit into my palms. The gavel struck the wood, a sound of finality. I was pulled back to the present. Judge Elijah Rourke, a man whose face was etched with the weariness of seeing too much of human nature's worst, stood at the bench. His voice was deep, cutting through the murmurs. "All rise." The room obeyed. It was a moment of absolute stillness, a pause before the final act. I looked at the jury box. 12 faces, ordinary, middle-aged people, some bored, some nervous, some seemingly attentive. They were the arbiters of my reality, the people who would decide which version of the truth was more convenient. As the bailiff administered the oath, I raised my right hand, palm open, and repeated the ancient promise. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God." The words were almost swallowed by my dry throat, but they were the most honest I had spoken in 3 years. As the leather Bible was withdrawn and the room settled, the full, crushing weight of the moment descended. This wasn't just about Vivian's accountability for the nightly beatings, the physical trauma, the sheer terror I experienced after my father left. Those were merely the symptoms of a far greater disease. The true scope of the crime lay buried in the digital files I had risked everything to acquire: the forged signatures on the life insurance policies, the fake LLCs, Redridge Vista Holdings and Harborline Ridge Investments, that served as conduits for skimming Daniel's bonuses, the quiet, strategic changes to the Sloan Heritage Security Trust document. That trust, a multi-million-dollar shield set up by my late grandfather and backed by my mother's residual estate, was meant to protect me, Lillian Martin, until I reached the age of 40, safeguarding my financial future from the inevitable intrusion of Daniel's next wife. It was a failsafe, a legacy meant to be untouchable. But Vivian had touched it. She hadn't just changed the terms. She had attempted to vaporize me from the beneficiary list entirely, replacing me with a new, innocuous-sounding charitable foundation she controlled. The physical abuse was the smoke and mirrors, the terror designed to keep the victim, me, quiet, compliant, and unable to connect the dots between a stinging cheek and a wire transfer of $400,000 routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. When I finally stepped down from this stand, having told my truth, one of two things would happen. The scales of justice would tip, and Vivian Sloan, the woman who had used brawling violence and breathtaking financial fraud to erase me, would confront the consequences, or the smooth, polished narrative of Grant Mercer would prevail. The jury would see me as the unstable, money-hungry fraud they painted, and my entire life, my career, my credibility, my healing, would collapse into a single, devastating verdict of not guilty. Though the latter choice, I understood, would be a final, irreversible form of violence. The prosecutor, Marissa Cole, walked toward me, ready to begin the direct examination. I straightened my spine against the hard wood, took a deep, shaky breath, and met her gaze. The game had begun. The truth, in all its ugly, complex reality, was about to be laid bare. One word, one receipt, one chilling audio clip at a time. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first sound of a long-suppressed story. 3 years ago, I was 26, recently returned to my childhood home in the Denver suburbs, still navigating that awkward, transitional phase after earning my master's degree. I was working a data analysis freelance gig, chipping away at my $40,000 student loan debt, using my old bedroom as a temporary office. I felt like a functional adult who happened to be crashing at her father's house. Everything felt temporary, unstable, and I liked the sense of control that temporary offered. Then Daniel, my father, delivered the news during a Sunday brunch. Big trip coming up, Lillian, 3 weeks in Singapore this time. Frontier Meridian Logistics is expanding their APAC hub. Frontier Meridian, his fictionalized transportation and logistics company, was his entire world, consuming 60 or 70 hours a week of his time. It was a source of pride, and now, a source of dread for me. That evening, the three of us gathered for a farewell dinner, a meticulously staged domestic scene. Vivian played the role of the devoted, gentle wife with breathtaking precision. She wore a silk dress that mirrored the pale gold of the expensive Chardonnay she was pouring. "Just 3 weeks, darling, and then you're back in the States," she cooed, topping up Daniel's glass with a hand that never trembled. She turned to me, her smile wide and warm, almost predatory in its sincerity. "And while Daddy's away, Lillian, you and I will have all the girl time we've missed out on. Think of it as a belated stepmother-daughter retreat." The words were saccharine, but her eyes, they were the tell. Every time Daniel leaned down to check his phone, her face tightened, and her gaze, fixed on me, sharpened into something cold and metallic, like a pair of surgical shears. It was a silent warning, a promise of what was to come once the shield was gone. Daniel, distracted by an urgent email about shipment manifests, missed the entire exchange. He never looked up. He never saw the shears. The next morning, the clock hit 9:45 a.m. Daniel's flight was long airborne. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when Vivian swept in, abandoning the saccharine mask before the front door's echo even died. She surveyed me, my worn denim and a loose-fitting tee, then scanned the kitchen counter, which held a stack of my research printouts. She didn't speak the pleasantries of the night before. Instead, her voice was low, laced with contempt, the sound of rubbing sandpaper. "You know, it's quite something to see a graduate from a respected university still shuffling around in clothes that look like they're from a charity bin," she began, pulling a bottle of high-end scotch from the liquor cabinet, though it was barely mid-morning. "And those degrees, data analysis, so utterly useless in the real world, isn't it? When are you going to stop freelancing and start contributing? Lillian, it's tiresome watching you leech off Daniel's goodwill." The barrage of insults about my useless degree, my sadly limited wardrobe, and the fact that I was eating up the heating budget instead of being a properly independent adult was relentless. It wasn't just criticism. It was an exercise in power, designed to make me feel small, disposable, and utterly reliant on the roof over my head. That first night, the tension peaked over something absurd. A dropped crystal tumbler. I was loading the dishwasher, and my hand slipped. The sound of the glass shattering against the granite countertop seemed to trigger a catastrophic shift. "Clumsy!" Vivian shouted, the sudden volume making me flinch. She had been on her second glass of wine, sprawled on the velvet sofa, watching a meaningless reality show. "You can't even handle a glass that cost $120. How do you expect to handle a career or a life?" I bent down immediately to start sweeping the shards, muttering an apology. That was my mistake, showing humility. Vivian lunged. She didn't just push me, she shoved me with surprising force, sending me stumbling backward until my hip hit the sharp corner of the kitchen island. A wave of nauseating pain made me cry out. Before I could regain my balance, she had crossed the short space. She didn't use an open palm. She used the back of her hand, the heavy solitaire ring catching my cheekbone with a sickening thwack. The impact was immediate, blinding, and hot. "Don't you dare apologize to me with that meek, pitiful voice," she hissed, standing over me while I struggled not to fall onto the glass shards. "I'm not one of your graduate professors you can charm. Now, you'll clean up this mess properly, every speck, and while you're down there, you're going to listen to me tell you exactly how useless and ungrateful you are for living in this house for free." The physical violence was brief, but the emotional assault lasted another 45 minutes. She forced me to scrub the floor while she stood sentinel, pouring wine and delivering a monologue of calculated humiliation. Useless. Ungrateful. The constant reminder that Daniel might pay for my upkeep, but it was she who dictated the terms of my life. That night established the new rules. The physical violence wasn't random. It was pedagogical. It was meant to discipline, to terrorize, and to keep me off balance. For the subsequent nights of Daniel's 3-week trip, the pattern was brutally consistent, like a metronome ticking down to my sanity's end. Vivian would start drinking around 5 p.m., escalating her consumption throughout the evening. She would find an arbitrary fault. A dish left to soak too long, the wrong choice of television channel, the way I breathed. The atmosphere in the house was a thick, volatile gas, waiting for a spark. I learned to live in a state of perpetual, low-grade fear. Around 11 p.m., the sound of her heavy footsteps on the hardwood would send an electric jolt through me. My sanctuary became the small, slightly cramped bedroom I'd grown up in. Every night, after she passed out or retreated to her wing of the house, I would lock my door, then drag a heavy antique armchair from the corner and wedge it tightly under the doorknob. Only then, with the physical barricade in place, did I dare try to sleep. The manipulation extended across the Pacific Ocean. Every evening at precisely 7 p.m. Denver time, which was 9 a.m. in Singapore, Vivian would demand a family check-in. Smile, Lillian. Look happy. Tell your father how much fun we had baking cookies today. She'd instruct, her hand resting heavily on my shoulder, her fingers digging in just hard enough to be painful but not leave a visible bruise. I would stand there, my cheek still tender from the backhand, forcing a wide, brittle smile into the camera. Everything's wonderful, Dad. We had a great, relaxing day. Vivian's being so sweet. My voice would be artificially bright, a performance designed to sell him the lie he desperately wanted to buy, that all was well on the home front. Vivian would lean in, put her arm around me, and give Daniel a theatrical kiss on the cheek, cementing the perfect illusion of peace and maternal care. He would beam back, relieved, reassured that his absence wasn't causing any trouble. Desperation led me to attempt communication outside the staged calls. I tried sending Daniel subtle, coded emails to his work address. I wrote about feeling overwhelmed by stress and misunderstandings at home, using ambiguous terms that could be read as either anxiety or actual distress. I needed him to ask a single, pointed question. The reply came back 2 days later, signed with my own name, my own email address, but the tone was utterly foreign, too cheerful, too generic. Don't worry about those little home squabbles. Dad, everything is very safe, very loved here. No need to stress about me. Focus on closing that deal. I stared at the screen, a cold realization dawning. Vivian had access. She hadn't just guessed my password. She had confessed to it, obliquely, during one of her wine-fueled rants. I help Daniel with his emails when he's on his trips. Just to keep things efficient. She was not just monitoring my attempts to reach out. She was actively impersonating me, neutralizing my cries for help before they could even register as a threat to her operation. I was entirely isolated, every avenue of communication compromised. The emotional terror was almost as effective as the physical blows. It was a form of gaslighting that made me question my own sanity. Was I truly ungrateful? Was I blowing a small argument out of proportion? But the final realization that this was much larger than mere domestic rivalry came one night when I mentioned leaving. I was on the phone with Lena, my college roommate, trying to sound casual, saying I was looking at apartments in Aurora. Vivian had overheard. She marched into the living room, silent but terrifyingly focused. She didn't strike me that time. Instead, she threw a heavy manila folder onto the mahogany coffee table, the contents scattering like playing cards. You want to leave, Lillian? Go ahead, but you might want to see what happens when you decide to be independent. The scattered pages were financial documents, transfer of assets, notarized signatures, and something called an interspousal control agreement. They showed Daniel had, over the course of the last year, primarily during his longer, more draining business trips, transferred control of several major assets, including their primary investment accounts and the deed to the mountain cabin, directly into Vivian's name. Nestled within the stack was a draft of a new last will and testament. I picked it up with a trembling hand. My name, Lillian Martin, was listed under the section detailing residual beneficiaries, but it was so minimal, so far down the list. A paltry 5% of what remained after every major asset, property, and insurance policy had been routed to Vivian Sloan or trusts controlled by her. The font size felt smaller. The text almost faded. A terrifying visual metaphor for my diminishing presence in my own family's narrative. Vivian leaned over the table, her breath smelling of expensive wine and malice. If you dare breathe a word of this, of these silly, insignificant arguments we've been having, to anyone, especially Daniel or a lawyer, I will scrub you clean, financially, legally, and socially. I have the papers. I have the power. I will make sure Daniel signs the final version, and then you'll be left with nothing but student debt and a reputation as a crazy person who can't handle a simple disagreement. Her voice dropped to a guttural snarl. And who do you think they'll believe? Lillian, the sophisticated wife with the clean charity record, or the neurotic daughter who was conveniently put on temporary leave from her job because she claimed her stepmother was hitting her? The weight of her words, the calculated threat to weaponize the system against me, to use the physical violence as justification for institutionalizing me, felt heavier than any blow. The beatings were not the end goal. They were merely the engine of coercion, the mechanism to keep me emotionally shattered and terrified enough not to look closely at the moving parts of the financial machine she was building. She was using my fear as camouflage for theft. That night, lying on my bed with the barricade of the armchair pressing against the door, I understood the true stakes. It wasn't about a temporary trip to Singapore. It was about an irreversible disappearance from my own life story. My compliance was her financial freedom. My silence was her multi-million-dollar inheritance. The thought alone gave me the first genuine spark of resistance. Survival wasn't enough. I had to start fighting back, on her turf, where the real battle was being waged, in the paperwork. The second week of Daniel's absence was worse than the first. The physical pain was secondary to the chilling realization that my fate was being decided in the glossy pages of legal documents scattered across the coffee table. The violence was just the psychological mechanism, the shock collar keeping me from investigating. But after she threw that final folder at me, the terror started to give way to a cold, analytical resolve, the same focus I used for debugging complex data sets at work. If this was a system, it had vulnerabilities. One morning, after a particularly bad night, a sustained argument where Vivian had cornered me in the hallway and twisted my arm hard enough to leave a deep, blossoming purple bruise, I had to go to the emergency room. My story was flimsy, rehearsed. I missed a step coming down the back staircase, tripped on the rug, and landed awkwardly. A minor care center, away from our known family doctor, felt safer. The nurse who processed me, a kind, pragmatic woman named Sharon, didn't say a word about my obviously rehearsed excuse. She didn't pry or judge. But as she handed me my discharge papers, confirming a sprained wrist and advising rest, she slipped a small, laminated card into my palm beneath the clipboard. The card was stark white, bearing only a logo and a 7-digit number for the Denver Coalition for Domestic Support. I felt a rush of both relief and immediate panic. She saw it. Someone saw it. I shoved the card deep into the pocket of my jeans. I was overwhelmed by the fear that Vivian had instilled. If I called that number, if I used that card, I would be labeled unstable, hysterical, crazy. Grant Mercer would tear me apart in court, using the very act of seeking help as proof of my mental deficiency. I was still too close to the fire to seek official shelter. I needed proof that the system, not just the house, was corrupt. Later that afternoon, the mundane task of paying bills opened the door to the hidden architecture of their financial life. I was paying the utilities online, a task Daniel had always done, but he'd briefly shown me the shared financial portal years ago, a generic login that still somehow worked. The portal linked to a range of family accounts, most of which I knew: checking, savings, a few retirement funds. But as I clicked through the menu, something was missing. My mother's legacy. When she died 12 years ago, she had left me a sizable inheritance, primarily tied up in long-term insurance policies and a few blue-chip investments. Daniel had assured me it was safe, compounding, set aside specifically for my future. Now, the account names: M. Martin Memorial Insurance, L. Martin Educational Investment Fund, were gone, completely vanished from the dashboard, or, in the case of two of the investment funds, their ownership details had been subtly changed, renamed under ambiguous titles like the Ridgeview Portfolio or Sloan Family Growth. The change was so subtle, so professionally executed, that anyone not intimately familiar with my mother's estate would never have noticed. I clicked deeper, feeling the cold, clinical rush of the data analyst taking over the traumatized victim. I wasn't looking at a bruise anymore. I was looking at a database error, and errors are fixable. I found a new name I had never heard of: the Sloan Heritage Security Trust. It was a complicated, multi-layered document, but Daniel's name was prominently listed as the grantor. Skimming the dense legalese, I found the section detailing beneficiaries: In the most current electronic scan, the space where a primary heir's name should have been listed simply said Vivian Sloan, with a tiny, almost invisible asterisk next to it directing to a minor charitable fund. But when I scrolled further down, I found an older, lower-resolution scanned draft, dated roughly 5 years prior, shortly after Daniel married Vivian, but before his company hit its major growth phase. It was barely legible, but the words were crystal clear: Lillian Martin, primary contingent beneficiary, and across my name, in a harsh, permanent-looking black marker, was a thick, purposeful line, a literal scratch-out. It was the moment on paper when my future had been systematically erased. The money was the objective. The violence was the deterrent. My investigation had to become covert. I started listening to every interaction, every phone call. One afternoon, I heard Vivian on the sun porch, speaking in hushed, smug tones. I crept closer, hiding just beyond the glass door, straining to hear her voice over the fountain outside. "Look, the paperwork is nearly finished. Once Daniel's next big bonus comes through, the one from the APAC expansion, which is going to be easily $200,000, and the final document closures are in place, I will truly have my hands on the entire steering wheel." A short, triumphant laugh. "That girl thinks a few tears will change things, but she doesn't understand the long game. Daniel's business is my business now." The words confirmed my worst fear. This was not just about the old trust. It was an ongoing operation, timed to coincide with major financial liquidity events. The beatings were meant to keep me too terrified, too exhausted, and too focused on my physical safety to notice the intricate legal and financial ballet happening in the background. I knew I had to find something concrete, something with Daniel's original intent. That night, I waited until 3 a.m., when the house was silent, and Vivian's heavy, wine-induced snoring could be heard faintly through the walls. I crept into Daniel's home office, a place he rarely used since he preferred working at Frontier Meridian. The office was neat, but Daniel's sense of organization always meant deep piles. I focused on the locked filing cabinet in the corner, which I knew he kept unlocked for his golf clubs and extraneous papers. Deep in the back, tucked inside a faded blue folder marked Estate Planning 2013, I found what I was looking for. A thick stack of documents, my mother's will, life insurance claim forms, and a comprehensive estate plan drafted immediately after her death. The language was unambiguous. I was the primary beneficiary. Vivian's name appeared only in a conditional clause regarding property upkeep, and she was explicitly excluded from handling any funds allocated to me. I flipped the stack over. On the back of the very last page, a document detailing the transfer of some small, illiquid assets, was a small, hastily scribbled note in my father's familiar, slightly slanting hand. In dark blue ink, it read, "V. I signed the new draft exactly as you wanted. We will discuss Lillian's portion later." The note was dated exactly 7 days into one of Daniel's longest ever business trips, a 4-week venture to the Middle East the year before, the same trip during which Vivian had subtly, yet ruthlessly, cut off my access to my college savings account under the guise of responsible transfer. The realization hit me with the physical force of a punch. Daniel hadn't been actively involved in the fraud. He had been the useful idiot. He hadn't read the drafts. He had simply signed whatever Vivian placed in front of him, trusting her to manage the messy adult papers so he could focus on his lucrative career abroad. She had used his love for his work and his profound, guilt-driven desire to avoid conflict as her tool. She hadn't forced him. She had simply made it easier for him to look away. The physical abuse had been terrifying, but this discovery, the cold, calculated betrayal woven into the legal fabric of my life, was what truly hardened me. Vivian hadn't just used her fists. She had weaponized my father's signature, my grief, and the system itself. My analyst brain took over completely. I pulled out my phone, turning off the flash and silencing the shutter noise. Page by page, I photographed everything. The original trust language, the scratch-out on the old scan, the explicit exclusion clauses, Daniel's handwritten note, and the list of new, ambiguous account names. I created a new, highly encrypted folder on a remote cloud server I had designed for my data security clients. I tagged the images with dates and specific financial identifiers, creating a digital vault, a case file that could be accessed anywhere, regardless of what happened to the physical papers. I was building my evidence archive, a silent rebellion executed at 3:30 a.m. I finished just before dawn, replacing every document precisely where I found it. I was no longer just a victim of domestic violence. I was a witness to grand financial fraud, and I had the proof locked away in the cloud. The next morning, Daniel was still away, due back in 3 days. Vivian, sipping her herbal tea, caught me in the kitchen. Her demeanor was unsettlingly breezy, back to the sweet stepmother role. "Good morning, darling," she chirped. "Your father and I are just updating the title on the house and a few other small family matters. Grown-up business. You know, nothing for you to concern yourself with." She smiled, a tiny knowing flash that told me she wasn't just updating the title, she was finalizing my erasure. "Don't worry about it," she repeated, her eyes daring me to challenge her. But I understood. If I didn't worry, if I didn't act, I would disappear from everything that was truly mine, not just the money, but the ability to control my own narrative, my own legacy. The fight was no longer about survival in that house. It was about reclaiming the future that she had signed away, forged, and beaten me into ignoring. My next move had to be outside the house, but the documentation had to be flawless before I took that leap. Daniel returned home from Singapore, but the house didn't regain its equilibrium. If anything, the atmosphere grew heavier, choked by unspoken guilt and the residue of Vivian's terror campaign. He was physically present, yet utterly absent, a ghost in his own marriage. He was perpetually exhausted, consumed by the demands of frontier meridian logistics, often working in his study until past 1 a.m. He looked at me, his only daughter, but he didn't see me. He saw an echo of the conflict he had chosen to ignore, and he kept his distance, a man petrified of facing the consequences of his willful blindness. I continued my freelance work, stockpiling my money, playing the role of the quiet, compliant stepdaughter while covertly building my digital vault. My wrist was still tender, but the bruises were fading, replaced by a cold, surgical focus. Then, about 3 weeks after Daniel's return, the anomaly arrived. It was a standard-sized manila envelope, tucked into the mail slot among junk flyers and glossy magazines. There was no stamp, no return address, just my name, Lillian Martin, typed in a clean, sharp font on a generic white label. It was the mark of a professional, someone who knew how to cover their tracks. I snatched it out of the pile, a sudden, electric premonition of danger and salvation twisting in my gut. I took it to the sanctuary of my room and carefully sliced the seal with an X-Acto knife. Inside was a meticulously clean photocopy, not of the current, compromised estate papers, but of a document I had only glimpsed in the old scan, the original Sloan Family Trust Agreement. This version was starkly different. It was dated 12 years ago, signed shortly after my mother's passing. It explicitly stated that upon Daniel's death, the bulk of his liquid assets, including his life insurance payout and the proceeds from the sale of the Denver house, would be placed into a trust managed solely for me, Lillian Martin, until I reached the age of 40. It was a fortress designed to protect me from the very scenario I was living. The document bore Daniel's undeniable signature, and beneath it, the elegant script of the witnessing attorney, Martin Halbrook, of Halbrook and Avery, LLP. But it was the handwritten note scribbled in the margin that made the breath catch in my throat. It wasn't Daniel's hand. It was a tighter, more formal script, clearly written by someone with legal training. It read, "Lillian must be protected should Vivian remarry or attempt to assert control over the principal." This wasn't just a document. It was a lifeline, a tangible link to a plan designed to safeguard me. And the person who sent it was signaling an alliance, an anonymous acknowledgement that my struggle was real, and that the financial manipulation had been foreseen. I immediately sat down at my laptop, ignoring the tingling of fear, and searched for Halbrook and Avery LLP. The firm existed, a reputable but small entity specializing in estate and probate law in downtown Denver. I searched for the attorney's name, Martin Halbrook. The search results were sparse, confusing, and profoundly unsettling. The local Denver Bar Association profile stated Mr. Halbrook had retired abruptly almost 2 years ago. Then, an older, tiny snippet from a local news blog surfaced. It mentioned a small, unexplained fire in the Halbrook and Avery storage room, where they kept decades of client files, around the same time as Halbrook's sudden retirement. No police report, no detailed follow-up, just a quick, sanitized mention, a classic cover-up. My heart hammered against my ribs. A random fire? Or a deliberate, surgical eradication of paper trails that tied powerful clients to questionable legal actions? I dialed the firm's main number, posing as a former client interested in retrieving an old will draft. The receptionist was polite, but her tone shifted the moment I mentioned Mr. Halbrook's name. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Halbrook relocated out of state. He left no forwarding contact information," I pressed, asking if the fire had affected his client files. There was a perceptible pause on the line, a hesitation that lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds, but felt like an eternity. "We have since digitized all of our active records. Ma'am, I can't speak to the status of files dating back more than 10 years. Her voice was stiff, formal, the kind of tone used when reading a prepared statement. I had the chilling feeling that she was afraid to say more, afraid the line was monitored or that her answers would be traced. Whoever had sent me the envelope, they were connected to a world where legal offices were subject to unexplained fires and staff were too scared to confirm the obvious. That evening, the house felt charged with silent surveillance. Daniel was in his study, supposedly catching up on Frontier Meridian reports. I was trying to read in the living room, but the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. Vivian walked in, carrying her habitual evening glass of scotch. She didn't sit down. She stood directly across from me, blocking the light. "Having a productive afternoon, Lillian?" she asked, her voice too casual, too sweet. I kept my gaze on my book. "Just catching up on some industry reports. Vivian." She laughed, a short, sharp, entirely humorless sound. "Oh, not those reports. I mean your little side investigation." My stomach dropped like a stone, but I forced my face to remain placid, projecting the bored neutrality of the stepdaughter she wanted to believe I was. "I'm sorry. I don't know what you mean." She put the glass down on the end table with an unnecessary thud. "Don't play coy. Daniel told me you've been poking around in old papers, looking up old law firms, asking questions about things that no longer concern you." The air thinned. Daniel had told her? Or had someone else? Someone inside the firm? Someone who had intercepted my phone call or seen the mail delivery, immediately informed her? The latter seemed more plausible. Vivian's network of influence wasn't just in Denver, it extended into the professional services meant to uphold justice. "I only looked up the firm that handled my mother's probate." I lied smoothly. "Curiosity about the old family attorney, nothing more." Vivian's composure broke, not in fury, but in a flash of contemptuous arrogance. "You think that shabby little photocopy someone mailed you changes anything?" she sneered, her voice edged with genuine malice. Her eyes narrowed. "That paper is worthless. It's an outdated draft, written by a paranoid old man who probably feared the entire world. And guess what, Lillian? Those actual papers? They disappeared 2 years ago, right around the time the storage room conveniently had its little smoke incident. No one can find them, not the probate court, not the firm, and certainly not some pitiful little data analyst." She had confessed, in her haste to assert her power and mock the anonymous helper. Vivian had confirmed the conspiracy. The fire was a cover-up, and she knew exactly where the documents had gone. The manila envelope hadn't been a random act of kindness. It was a desperate leak from within a system she had successfully corrupted. The person who sent it knew the original trust was untraceable through official channels and had only been able to get a quick copy before the complete erasure. Vivian laughed again, a sound that tasted like bile. So go ahead. Talk to the courts. Tell them your fantasy. They'll ask for evidence. And you'll hand them a copy of a copy, signed by a lawyer who suddenly decided to move 3,000 miles away and disappear. They'll think you're delusional. Her confidence was terrifying, based on the fundamental assumption that the entire legal system would always prioritize clean, recent paperwork over the testimony of a traumatized stepdaughter. I retreated to my room, locking the door and wedging the armchair under the knob. I was shaking, not from fear of the blow, but from the scale of the rot I had uncovered. My fight wasn't against one malicious woman. It was against a powerful shadow network she commanded. I went straight to my laptop. The memory of the terrified receptionist's voice, the fire, and Vivian's chilling confession crystallized my next move. I was going to be redundant. I would ensure that if I was disappeared, the evidence would not be. I created a new, hypersecure directory on my cloud server. I called it simply, If I Disappear. Into this vault, I uploaded every piece of evidence, the photographs of the forged documents, the scanned original from the manila envelope, the screenshot of the Halbrook news snippet, my medical discharge papers from the ER, and every single coded journal entry detailing the abuse, meticulously logged with times and dates over the last 4 weeks. The final piece of this emergency plan was my closest friend, Lena Ortiz, my former college roommate. Lena was an architect, pragmatic and fiercely loyal. I called her, keeping my voice utterly devoid of panic. Lena, I need you to do something for me, I said. I've set up a shared folder on a new encrypted server. I've sent you the key and the password. But do not open it. Promise me you won't. It's code locked to unlock after 96 hours of inactivity from my primary accounts. Lena, thankfully, knew me well enough not to pry when I used that tone. Lillian, are you okay? What's going on? I am fine, Lena. But if you don't hear from me, really hear from me, for more than 3 days, or if you get a strange text message that doesn't include the word Aurora, you open that file. It contains important instructions and documentation. You just need to follow the instructions precisely. Do not call the police first. Call the person whose name is on the top document. I didn't tell her about the abuse, the beatings, or the millions of dollars. The burden was too heavy to share unnecessarily. I just needed a contingency, a fire extinguisher for the fire she was trying to start. Lena swore she would keep the information locked down. Hanging up, I felt a strange sense of calm. Vivian could burn the paper. She could threaten the lawyers, and she could try to disappear me. But now, the truth was out of her reach. It was locked down by 256-bit encryption, stored in multiple geographical locations, and protected by the loyalty of the one person who would never believe Vivian's story. I was still trapped in the house with her, but I was no longer just the object of her manipulation. I was the keeper of the evidence, ready to be the player in a game that was rapidly escalating from domestic control to high-stakes legal warfare. I just needed to survive long enough to walk out the front door for good. The breaking point wasn't the pain, it was the proximity to finality. It happened on a dreary Tuesday, about 2 months after Daniel's return. The latest argument was about the volume of my music, a low jazz track that Vivian claimed gave her a headache. She had been drinking since noon, pacing the living room, searching for a target. When I tried to disengage and walk away, she screamed a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and grabbed the heavy crystal candelabra, a wedding gift she prized, easily worth $4,000. She didn't throw it immediately. She held it aloft, the faceted crystal catching the light, and paused, her eyes wide and entirely vacant. The candelabra missed my head by perhaps an inch when she finally hurled it, shattering against the wall behind me. I stood there, showered in sparkling shards, the metallic scent of dust and fear filling my lungs. I finally saw it. This wasn't just coercion. It was outright malice. She wasn't trying to scare me into compliance anymore. She was trying to eliminate the problem. The thought of waiting for Daniel to wake up, to see the truth, felt utterly naive. I had to leave now. I acted on pure adrenaline. I grabbed my pre-packed, small backpack, the one containing the laptop with the "if I disappear" file, my passport, my mother's old signet ring, and roughly $300 in emergency cash. I ignored the clothes, the books, everything else. I walked out of the bedroom, past the crystal shards still littering the hallway floor, and into Daniel's study. I found a notepad and scrawled a short, painful note. "Dad, I'm leaving. I can't stay here anymore. When you are ready to look at the truth, truly look at it. Call me. Until then, I am safe, L." I left the note propped against his favorite golf trophy, walked out the front door, and never looked back. The sudden freedom was terrifying and intoxicating. I drove straight to Aurora, pulling up outside Lena's slightly run-down, comfortable apartment building. Lena, bless her pragmatic soul, simply opened the door, handed me a glass of water, and didn't ask a single question about the terror in my eyes. The first few weeks were rough. The psychological residue lingered. I would wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, around 3:30 a.m. most mornings, convinced I heard Vivian's high heels clicking down the hallway outside Lena's modest apartment. But slowly, inevitably, the silence began to heal the noise. The chair was no longer wedged under the door. I realized the only footfalls I heard were the harmless ones of Lena's neighbor on the floor above. The fear was receding, replaced by a cold, hard determination. Lena was my catalyst. "Lillian, you can't just stop. You have to finish what you started," she insisted one Saturday morning, pushing my resume across the small kitchen table. "You are brilliant. Get a job. A real job. Use that focus on the fraud you saw." I listened. I applied to 3 firms, and within a week, I landed a full-time position as a data security analyst at Northline Insight Systems, a cybersecurity firm known for its meticulous risk assessment work for major banks and logistics companies. My new job was my salvation. It was a baptism by fire, forcing me to shift from passive victim to strategic player. I spent 8 hours a day, sometimes 10 or 12, diving into financial flows, examining the structures of complex shell corporations, and identifying points of systemic weakness and potential money laundering for clients. I applied the skills I was being paid to hone directly to my private war, using anonymous shell accounts and specialized data mining tools. I began to systematically trace every company related to my father's fictional frontier meridian. It was a rabbit hole. I pulled public records on Redridge Vista Holdings and Harborline Ridge Investments, the shady LLCs Vivian had mentioned. My analysis revealed a pattern. These companies had no actual employees, no physical plant, and virtually zero operational expenses. Their sole function was as a funnel. They received huge capital injections, Daniel's quarterly bonuses, my mother's old investment yields, and the initial withdrawal of $400,000 from the now renamed Sloan Heritage Security Trust. The money would sit there for precisely 72 hours, then be routed into various joint ventures that were exclusively managed and eventually owned by Vivian Sloan. It was textbook financial fraud, masked by the complexity of shell companies and Daniel's signature. This wasn't petty abuse, it was grand larceny achieved through domestic coercion. I knew I needed a champion, someone who understood both the legal and the human dimensions of this crime. I couldn't afford a high-priced lawyer like Grant Mercer. Nor did I trust a typical firm to handle the delicate combination of abuse and financial conspiracy. I found an opening at a local pro bono legal clinic, the Denver Legal Aid Services, and requested a consultation on financial abuse. That's where I met Malik Jensen. Malik was in his late 30s, calm and intense, with a meticulous habit of folding his hands on his desk, his gaze unwavering. He specialized in coercive control, a relatively new legal framework that recognized financial stripping and psychological manipulation as forms of abuse. I laid out the entire narrative: the initial violence, the compromised communications, the discovery of the forged documents, the disappearance of the old trust, the anonymous manila envelope, and my detailed analysis of the money flowing into Redridge Vista Holdings. As I spoke, detailing the 3 years of systematic erosion of my life, Malik didn't just listen. He absorbed, taking notes not just on the assault dates, but on the transaction dates. "It's classic," Malik murmured, nodding slowly when I finished my story, which took almost 2 hours to tell. "The physical violence is the smoke. It keeps you focused on survival, while the fire, the financial erasure, burns down the house. Your stepmother used the fear of being labeled mentally unstable to keep you from speaking the truth about the money." He confirmed my strategy. The original financial documents, the ones detailing the trust until I turned 40, coupled with my evidence of coercion and fraud, were their lever. "We can't just focus on the assault, Lillian," Malik explained, leaning forward. "Domestic violence is often treated as a private matter and easily dismissed by a high-priced defense attorney. But financial fraud, especially fraud this systematic, involving multiple shell corporations and the intentional suppression of legal documents, that's a crime against the state. We use your evidence of abuse to explain why you didn't speak up sooner, but we charge her with the grand theft." He proposed a comprehensive strategy, a civil suit to reopen the trust and recover the transferred assets, using the original Halbrook document as evidence of Daniel's intent, followed by presenting the compelling case of financial abuse and fraud to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The evidence was the backbone. Malik needed everything: the documents, the timestamps, the forged signatures, and crucially, the chronological narrative of my isolation and terror. I began the painstaking process of creating a master timeline. I started from the day Daniel left for Singapore 3 years ago and logged every event. Date: June 14, 2022. Event: found Daniel's note confirming signature of new draft. Financial impact: possible transfer of 5% stake into Redridge Vista. Date: July 19, 2022. Event: E.R. visit, sprained wrist, Nurse Sharon's card. Financial impact: 0, but confirms physical coercion while funds were moved. Each entry was a double-edged emotional sword. Reliving the terror made my hands tremble, but articulating the facts, quantifying the abuse, and pinning down the dates of the financial crimes gave me back a piece of my control. I was taking ownership of the narrative, moving it from the realm of chaotic trauma to the organized precision of a criminal case file. "Vivian's strength is her swiftness," Malik concluded during our third meeting. "She moved fast, covered her tracks with fire, and ensured she was the one who told the first story. The story that you are the problem. We cannot afford to be sloppy. We need to be slow, methodical, and build an absolutely irrefutable case. When we move, we hit her with everything at once. The abuse charges to establish coercion, and the financial charges to establish motive. No warning." We spent the next 6 months working in the shadows. I worked 50 hours a week at Northline Insight Systems, using my lunchtime and evenings to cross-reference public records, track down the notary public who witnessed the forgery, and gather more data. I was no longer just Lillian Martin, the graduate student crashing at home. I was a strategic adversary, building the case that would finally put an end to Vivian Sloane's power. The quiet life with Lena in Aurora was my staging ground, the calm before the devastating storm I was about to unleash on my former family. The text message from Daniel arrived late on a Wednesday, making the phone vibrate sharply on my desk at Northline Insight Systems. I stared at the screen for a full minute, the simple words feeling like a complex chemical warning. "Lillian, your mother and I need to talk. Viv says the family's too fractured. Come to Silver Pine Lodge this weekend. Just us. We need to heal." Silver Pine Lodge. It was a place etched in my memory with warmth, the scent of pine needles, and the crackle of wood smoke. It was where Daniel had taught me to fish, where my mother and I had watched the snow fall. It was my psychological anchor to a life before Vivian. Now, it felt like the perfect, nostalgic setting for a meticulously planned execution. I immediately forwarded the message to Malik Jensen. He called me 3 minutes later. "It's a trap," he stated, his voice clipped and entirely unamused. "A classic reconciliation setup, designed to elicit a signed settlement. She wants to clean this up internally, before we file the discovery motion next week. She knows we're close." "I know it is," I replied, my voice steady. The fear was there, but now it was sharp and contained, like a scalpel, not dull and paralyzing. "But she wants me to meet her on her terrain. She wants to show me she still has control. And Malik, she's bringing Daniel. This is the only way I can get Daniel's reaction to her narrative, and get Vivian to break character without the structure of a courtroom." I had a plan, a risky, calculated gambit based on the assumption that Vivian's arrogance was greater than her caution. "I'm going, Malik, but I have my tools. First, I'm running EchoSafe, a continuous audio recording app with a 300-foot buffer, straight out of my pocket. Second, Lena has the coordinates and an emergency response protocol. If I miss a check-in call at 9 p.m. sharp, she starts the clock. If I miss the 10 p.m. call, she hits the panic button." Malik conceded, but not happily. "You are the bait. Lillian, make sure the hook is clean. Get her to admit the coercion. Get her to admit to the suppression of the Halbrook Trust. Do not sign anything. Do not take the money." I arrived at Silver Pine Lodge late on Friday afternoon. The cabin was a stately dark wood fortress against the crisp, cold air of the Rocky Mountains. Smoke curled invitingly from the stone chimney. Everything was curated to project an image of idyllic, troubled but loving family life. Inside, the lighting was low and golden, the scent of pine and cinnamon masking the underlying tension. A crackling fire roared in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the expensive Navajo rugs. Dinner was already set. A beautiful, perfectly roasted venison, a dish my mother had always loved. Vivian met me at the door. Gone were the tailored silk and sharp edges of her courtroom attire. She wore a thick, cream-colored cashmere sweater and soft wool trousers, the picture of refined, nurturing elegance. Her smile was wide, her eyes shining with practiced maternal affection. "Lillian, darling, you made it," she cooed, embracing me quickly. It was the first time she had initiated contact since I walked out, and the artificial warmth of the cashmere against my cheek made me recoil internally. "We were so worried about you. Come on in, warm up. Your father just opened a fantastic Barolo." Throughout the dinner, the performance was relentless. Vivian never stopped using the word family. "We are family. Daniel, we stick together." She'd insist, pouring wine for Daniel and then a small glass for me. This entire unpleasantness, this division, it's just the result of miscommunication, of feeling unloved. We need to be 100% honest with each other now. Daniel, looking more haunted than ever, mostly just nodded and drank. He occasionally offered a platitude. "Your mother is right. Lillian, we need to put this behind us. It's been 3 terrible years." I played my role perfectly. I was the wary, slightly fragile daughter, willing to listen but clearly hurt. I spoke softly, focusing on the past, allowing Vivian to set the narrative of healing. The entire time, the EchoSafe app was running, nestled deep in the breast pocket of my wool coat, recording the crackle of the fire, the clink of the glasses, and every false syllable of Vivian's performance. After the dinner plates were cleared, Vivian orchestrated the next move. "Well, now that we've eaten, why don't we move into the study?" she suggested brightly, rising. "Your father and I have prepared some paperwork that will give all of us a clean slate and make sure we can truly move on." The study was small, paneled in rich cedar, dominated by a large mahogany desk. On the desk lay 2 stacks of documents, weighted down by a heavy brass paperweight. They were starkly titled Internal Settlement Agreement, Sloan Family Assets, and Family Non-Disclosure and Confidentiality Contract. The air immediately shifted from cozy to corporate. Vivian shed the last vestiges of her maternal disguise. Daniel sat awkwardly behind the desk, while Vivian stood to his right, fully in command. "Take a seat, Lillian," she instructed, gesturing to a stiff leather armchair. "We want you to read these documents carefully. The settlement agreement outlines a substantial one-time payment to you, enough for the down payment on a very nice condo in Aurora, maybe even a small house. We're talking a figure near $300,000. This is our olive branch, a gift of peace, to ensure you can have the independence you crave." She slid a sleek, expensive Mont Blanc pen toward me. "All you have to do is sign the non-disclosure. It simply states that you agree not to sue us or discuss these private family disputes, the emotional ones, publicly or legally, ever. Consider it the final chapter in this painful book, allowing us to be a real family again." I kept my hand away from the pen, my gaze fixed on the paperwork. "The down payment is generous, Vivian. But before I even look at that, I need to understand something. This non-disclosure requires me to silence myself regarding the disputes. Can you define those disputes for me? Clearly for the record?" Vivian paused. My calm tone and the request for a legal definition threw her off her stride. She hadn't expected the data analyst to show up. "Don't be difficult, Lillian. It's the arguments, the shouting, that silly incident with the crystal candelabra, which, by the way, I replaced for $6,000. It's the usual family drama." "No, Vivian," I pressed gently, my voice still low and steady, forcing her to lean in to hear me. "I mean the physical incidents, the nights when Daniel was away, when you would get angry and tell me I was useless, and then ensure I understood my place. Are those the disputes I'm being asked to never discuss?" The gentle veneer shattered, Vivian's face contorted, not with the calculated malice of the past, but with raw, defensive fury. The need to justify her actions, to claim moral superiority, was too strong to resist. The camera was rolling. Oh, for God's sake, Lillian, you are so dramatic. Yes, there were corrections. You were a spoiled, entitled burden, living under our roof, questioning my authority and Daniel's decisions at every turn. You needed to be shaped. Someone needed to show you the consequences of disrespect." Her voice rose sharply, a clear spike in the audio recording. "And yes, I slapped you, maybe 3 or 4 times over those 3 years. So what? They were open-hand slaps. A few minor hits when you crossed the line. Do you seriously think any judge, any jury, is going to listen to an adult complaining about a few slaps that happened in the privacy of her own home 3 years ago, when the supposed victim is sitting here demanding $300,000 to drop the claim? No! They'll call you a greedy, manipulative liar." Daniel shifted in his seat, looking deeply uncomfortable, his jaw clenched. He finally intervened, his voice hoarse. "Vivian, honey, that's enough. Just stick to the agreement." I seized the opening. I looked at Daniel, putting all the years of pain and confusion into my question. "Dad, the agreement also mentions the total dissolution of the old Sloan Heritage Security Trust, the one Grandpa set up for me, and it mentions the transfer of the last of Mom's insurance policies. Did you read those documents before you signed them over to Vivian's LLCs, Redridge Vista and Harborline Ridge, during your trips?" Daniel hesitated, his eyes darting to Vivian, who was now glaring at him, silently screaming for him to shut up. He looked defeated, cornered by his own willful ignorance. I didn't, not the full language. No, Vivian handles all the paperwork. She's the expert on the estates. I told her. Vivian, just handle the trusts and insurance. Make sure everything is efficient. She said it was all necessary to avoid the 40% capital gains tax and secure my assets. I was busy securing the Frontier Meridian deal. I trusted her to manage the administrative side. The admission was chilling. Daniel confirmed it. He signed blindly, giving Vivian the necessary legal authority to execute the fraud. He was not a conspirator, but the most crucial enabler. I guided Vivian back to the coercion. "So, you used the physical violence to keep me emotionally incapable of checking the papers your husband was signing?" "I used whatever was necessary to get compliance," she snapped, throwing her hands up in exasperation. I created a predictable environment. I made sure you were focused on your little bruises, not the $300,000 coming into the escrow accounts. It's called management. You were becoming a nuisance, threatening my position and Daniel's financial future. And I dealt with it. Efficiently. I pressed her, letting her anger fuel the recording. And what if I don't sign this non-disclosure? Vivian, if I walk out of here and take all my evidence to Malik and the district attorney, what happens then? Vivian stalked around the desk, stopping right in front of my chair. Her eyes were burning with pure, unadulterated menace. She leaned down, her voice a poisonous whisper that the microphone still caught with shocking clarity. Then I bury you. Lillian, you think I didn't plan for this? I already have the documentation. I will present the courts with signed affidavits from my doctors and the reports from our private security that confirm you. My sweet little stepdaughter, we're having erratic breakdowns. I will show them the HR report from your Northline suspension, the one that claimed you were paranoid. I will make sure the police receive 5 separate reports detailing your violent mood swings. I will drown you in official paperwork, and you will be institutionalized. You will be certified as mentally unstable, and your testimony about a few slaps and a missing trust fund will be laughed out of court. No one will believe the lunatic over the responsible wife. The threat was explicit, the full measure of her cynical power play. She was not just admitting to the violence and the financial manipulation. She was confessing to a deliberate, planned legal and psychological takedown. I stood up slowly, picking up my coat. I didn't reach for the Mont Blanc pen. I met her eyes, feeling a cold, righteous certainty settle deep in my bones. I think we're done here. Vivian, I said, my voice steady, the fear finally gone. I have all the clarity I need. I walked out of the cabin and into the freezing mountain night. The air was crisp, cleansing. As I drove away, down the winding, dark mountain road, I pulled out my phone. The EchoSafe app confirmed the recording. 87 minutes of pure, uncut confession, detailing the abuse, the coercion, the financial fraud, and the threat of institutionalization. The bomb was primed. It was no longer a question of if I would file charges, but when and how hard. Vivian had given us the entire case on a silver platter, delivered right into my pocket. The text message from Daniel arrived late on a Wednesday, making the phone vibrate sharply on my desk at Northline Insight Systems. I stared at the screen for a full minute, the simple words feeling like a complex chemical warning. Lillian, your mother and I need to talk. Viv says the family's too fractured. Come to Silver Pine Lodge this weekend. Just us. We need to heal. Silver Pine Lodge. It was a place etched in my memory with warmth, the scent of pine needles, and the crackle of wood smoke. It was where Daniel had taught me to fish, where my mother and I had watched the snow fall. It was my psychological anchor to a life before Vivian. Now, it felt like the perfect, nostalgic setting for a meticulously planned execution. I immediately forwarded the message to Malik Jensen. He called me 3 minutes later. It's a trap, he stated, his voice clipped and entirely unamused. A classic reconciliation setup, designed to elicit a signed settlement. She wants to clean this up internally, before we file the discovery motion next week. She knows we're close. I know it is, I replied, my voice steady. The fear was there, but now it was sharp and contained, like a scalpel, not dull and paralyzing. But she wants me to meet her on her terrain. She wants to show me she still has control. And Malik, she's bringing Daniel. This is the only way I can get Daniel's reaction to her narrative and get Vivian to break character without the structure of a courtroom. I had a plan, a risky, calculated gambit based on the assumption that Vivian's arrogance was greater than her caution. I'm going, Malik, but I have my tools. First, I'm running EchoSafe, a continuous audio recording app with a 300-foot buffer, straight out of my pocket. Second, Lena has the coordinates and an emergency response protocol. If I miss a check-in call at 9 p.m. sharp, she starts the clock. If I miss the 10 p.m. call, she hits the panic button. Malik conceded. but not happily. You are the bait. Lillian, make sure the hook is clean. Get her to admit the coercion. Get her to admit to the suppression of the Halbrook Trust. Do not sign anything. Do not take the money. I arrived at Silver Pine Lodge late on Friday afternoon. The cabin was a stately, dark wood fortress against the crisp, cold air of the Rocky Mountains. Smoke curled invitingly from the stone chimney. Everything was curated to project an image of idyllic, troubled but loving family life. Inside, the lighting was low and golden, the scent of pine and cinnamon masking the underlying tension. A crackling fire roared in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the expensive Navajo rugs. Dinner was already set, a beautiful, perfectly roasted venison, a dish my mother had always loved. Vivian met me at the door. Gone were the tailored silk and sharp edges of her courtroom attire. She wore a thick cream-colored cashmere sweater and soft wool trousers, the picture of refined, nurturing elegance. Her smile was wide, her eyes shining with practiced maternal affection. "Lillian, darling, you made it," she cooed, embracing me quickly. It was the first time she had initiated contact since I walked out, and the artificial warmth of the cashmere against my cheek made me recoil internally. "We were so worried about you. Come on in, warm up. Your father just opened a fantastic Barolo." Throughout the dinner, the performance was relentless. Vivian never stopped using the word family. "We are family. Daniel, we stick together." She'd insist, pouring wine for Daniel and then a small glass for me. This entire unpleasantness, this division, it's just the result of miscommunication, of feeling unloved. We need to be 100% honest with each other now. Daniel, looking more haunted than ever, mostly just nodded and drank. He occasionally offered a platitude. "Your mother is right. Lillian, we need to put this behind us. It's been 3 terrible years." I played my role perfectly. I was the wary, slightly fragile daughter, willing to listen but clearly hurt. I spoke softly, focusing on the past, allowing Vivian to set the narrative of healing. The entire time, the Echo Safe app was running, nestled deep in the breast pocket of my wool coat, recording the crackle of the fire, the clink of the glasses, and every false syllable of Vivian's performance. After the dinner plates were cleared, Vivian orchestrated the next move. "Well, now that we've eaten, why don't we move into the study?" she suggested brightly, rising. "Your father and I have prepared some paperwork that will give all of us a clean slate and make sure we can truly move on." The study was small, paneled in rich cedar, dominated by a large mahogany desk. On the desk lay 2 stacks of documents, weighted down by a heavy brass paperweight. They were starkly titled Internal Settlement Agreement, Sloan Family Assets, and Family Non-Disclosure and Confidentiality Contract. The air immediately shifted from cozy to corporate. Vivian shed the last vestiges of her maternal disguise. Daniel sat awkwardly behind the desk, while Vivian stood to his right, fully in command. "Take a seat, Lillian," she instructed, gesturing to a stiff leather armchair. "We want you to read these documents carefully. The settlement agreement outlines a substantial one-time payment to you, enough for the down payment on a very nice condo in Aurora, maybe even a small house. We're talking a figure near $300,000. This is our olive branch, a gift of peace, to ensure you can have the independence you crave." She slid a sleek, expensive Mont Blanc pen toward me. "All you have to do is sign the non-disclosure. It simply states that you agree not to sue us or discuss these private family disputes, the emotional ones, publicly or legally, ever. Consider it the final chapter in this painful book, allowing us to be a real family again." I kept my hand away from the pen, my gaze fixed on the paperwork. "The down payment is generous, Vivian, but before I even look at that, I need to understand something. This non-disclosure requires me to silence myself regarding the disputes. Can you define those disputes for me? Clearly, for the record?" Vivian paused. My calm tone and the request for a legal definition threw her off her stride. She hadn't expected the data analyst to show up. Don't be difficult. Lillian, it's the arguments, the shouting, that silly incident with the crystal candelabra, which, by the way, I replaced for $6,000. It's the usual family drama. No, Vivian, I pressed gently, my voice still low and steady, forcing her to lean in to hear me. I mean the physical incidents, the nights when Daniel was away, when you would get angry and tell me I was useless, and then ensure I understood my place. Are those the disputes I'm being asked to never discuss? The gentle veneer shattered. Vivian's face contorted, not with the calculated malice of the past, but with raw, defensive fury. The need to justify her actions, to claim moral superiority, was too strong to resist. The camera was rolling. Oh, for God's sake, Lillian! You are so dramatic. Yes, there were corrections. You were a spoiled, entitled burden, living under our roof, questioning my authority and Daniel's decisions at every turn. You needed to be shaped. Someone needed to show you the consequences of disrespect. Her voice rose sharply, a clear spike in the audio recording. And yes, I slapped you, maybe 3 or 4 times over those 3 years. So what? They were open-hand slaps. A few minor hits when you crossed the line. Do you seriously think any judge, any jury, is going to listen to an adult complaining about a few slaps that happened in the privacy of her own home 3 years ago, when the supposed victim is sitting here demanding $300,000 to drop the claim? No, they'll call you a greedy, manipulative liar. Daniel shifted in his seat, looking deeply uncomfortable, his jaw clenched. He finally intervened, his voice hoarse. Vivian, honey, that's enough. Just stick to the agreement. I seized the opening. I looked at Daniel, putting all the years of pain and confusion into my question. Dad, the agreement also mentions the total dissolution of the old Sloan Heritage Security Trust, the one Grandpa set up for me, and it mentions the transfer of the last of Mom's insurance policies. Did you read those documents before you signed them over to Vivian's LLCs, Redridge Vista and Harborline Ridge, during your trips? Daniel hesitated, his eyes darting to Vivian, who was now glaring at him, silently screaming for him to shut up. He looked defeated, cornered by his own willful ignorance. I didn't, not the full language. No, Vivian handles all the paperwork. She's the expert on the estates. I told her. Vivian, just handle the trusts and insurance. Make sure everything is efficient. She said it was all necessary to avoid the 40% capital gains tax and secure my assets. I was busy securing the Frontier Meridian deal. I trusted her to manage the administrative side. The admission was chilling. Daniel confirmed it. He signed blindly, giving Vivian the necessary legal authority to execute the fraud. He was not a conspirator, but the most crucial enabler. I guided Vivian back to the coercion. So, you used the physical violence to keep me emotionally incapable of checking the papers your husband was signing? I used whatever was necessary to get compliance, she snapped, throwing her hands up in exasperation. I created a predictable environment. I made sure you were focused on your little bruises, not the $300,000 coming into the escrow accounts. It's called management. You were becoming a nuisance, threatening my position and Daniel's financial future. And I dealt with it. Efficiently. I pressed her, letting her anger fuel the recording. And what if I don't sign this non-disclosure? Vivian, if I walk out of here and take all my evidence to Malik and the district attorney, what happens then? Vivian stalked around the desk, stopping right in front of my chair. Her eyes were burning with pure, unadulterated menace. She leaned down, her voice a poisonous whisper that the microphone still caught with shocking clarity. Then I bury you, Lillian. You think I didn't plan for this? I already have the documentation. I will present the courts with signed affidavits from my doctors and the reports from our private security that confirm you. My sweet little stepdaughter, we're having erratic breakdowns. I will show them the HR report from your Northline suspension, the one that claimed you were paranoid. I will drown you in official paperwork, and you will be institutionalized. You will be certified as mentally unstable, and your testimony, about a few slaps and a missing trust fund will be laughed out of court. No one will believe the lunatic over the responsible wife. The threat was explicit, the full measure of her cynical power play. She was not just admitting to the violence and the financial manipulation. She was confessing to a deliberate, planned legal and psychological takedown. I stood up slowly, picking up my coat. I didn't reach for the Mont Blanc pen. I met her eyes, feeling a cold, righteous certainty settle deep in my bones. "I think we're done here, Vivian," I said, my voice steady, the fear finally gone. "I have all the clarity I need." I walked out of the cabin and into the freezing mountain night. The air was crisp, cleansing. As I drove away, down the winding, dark mountain road, I pulled out my phone. The EchoSafe app confirmed the recording. 87 minutes of pure, uncut confession, detailing the abuse, the coercion, the financial fraud, and the threat of institutionalization. The bomb was primed. It was no longer a question of if I would file charges, but when and how hard. Vivian had given us the entire case on a silver platter, delivered right into my pocket. The full recording from Silver Pine Lodge, chilling and undeniable, was immediately transcribed and digitized. It was the linchpin of our case, providing the necessary criminal intent to accompany my financial analysis. Malik and I were preparing the final discovery motion to the district attorney's office, confident we had enough for a formal investigation. Exactly 1 week after I returned from the mountains, an email arrived in the encrypted mailbox I used solely for legal contacts. It was from an anonymous address. The subject line a single, precise phrase, Halbrook Files. The body of the email was brief, delivered with the urgency of a secret agent. "I was an assistant to Halbrook. I know what she did. Meet me in a crowded place. Tessa." I forwarded the email to Malik, who responded almost immediately. "It's the anonymous source, the one who sent the manila envelope. This is huge. Lillian, it means someone in their legal periphery is defecting. Meet her, but keep your phone and recording app running. Send me the coordinates." We chose a massive, impersonal coffee house in downtown Denver, packed with the lunchtime rush. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a simple hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses, feeling like a caricature of a spy. A woman walked up to my table. She was small, nervous, dressed in sensible business casual, clutching a worn leather handbag. She looked nothing like the shadowy figure I had imagined. "Lillian Martin?" she whispered, looking over her shoulder toward the window. "Tessa?" She sat down quickly, without even ordering coffee. Her hands were trembling slightly. "I can't stay long. I need to be back at my new job in Boulder in less than 2 hours." I hated seeing what she did. She confirmed my earlier suspicions. Tessa had been Martin Halbrook's personal assistant for over 7 years. The fire in the storage room? It was an intentional, controlled burn orchestrated by a high-priced security firm, hired specifically to destroy older, disadvantageous client files. The Sloan family's original estate plan, which heavily favored me, was at the top of the hit list. Vivian Sloan had an incredible amount of leverage, Tessa explained, her voice low and tight. Not just money, her husband's company, Frontier Meridian, was involved in contracts with several large, politically connected clients Halbrook represented. She leveraged that influence, telling him his whole career, his 35 years of work, would be ruined if he didn't cooperate. She needed the paper trail gone. Tessa reached into her bag and pulled out a small, nondescript USB drive. I didn't trust the fire. I saw what they were destroying. Halbrook was terrified, but he was also meticulous. Before he was forced into early retirement, I made a complete, encrypted backup of the most important files, including yours. She slid the drive across the table. This contains the master files, not just photocopies. This is the original, notarized trust agreement from 12 years ago, signed by both Daniel and your mother's estate executor. I looked at the small drive, holding the accumulated evidence of my mother's foresight and Vivian's conspiracy. It felt like holding a lightning bolt. I took the drive directly to Malik's office. We spent the next 4 hours downloading and meticulously cross-referencing the files Tessa had provided with my own screenshots and financial analysis. The difference between the original trust and the versions Vivian had created was staggering, proving an absolute, malicious intent. The original, dated just 6 months after my mother's death, was a masterwork of protective legal structuring. Then we found it, the golden ticket, hidden in the legal jargon of the original document. Section 3, Clause D, Revocation and Contingency of Beneficiary Status. It explicitly stated that if any beneficiary or trustee was found to have engaged in coercive control, physical violence, or financial exploitation against the grantor, Daniel, or the grantor's lineal descendants, me, that beneficiary's entire portion of the trust, as well as any associated control, would be automatically rendered null and void. The assets would immediately revert to the primary contingent beneficiary, which was me, Lillian. This clause was my complete, bulletproof defense. It meant Vivian's very actions, the beatings, the threats, the coercion captured on the silver pine tape, were the legal mechanism to revoke her own claim. The clause had completely vanished from the revised trust that Vivian had Daniel sign during his long trips, replaced with vague language about management efficiency and tax planning. She hadn't just changed the trust. She had amputated the one failsafe designed to protect me from her specific brand of abuse. The USB also contained internal memos from Martin Halbrook, in one memo, dated 2 years prior. Halbrook expressed deep suspicion regarding the sudden shift in financial control and explicit concerns of potential financial abuse against Ms. Martin. He noted that he felt professionally compromised and under implicit threat from a party with significant influence at Frontier Meridian and its legal partners. It was confirmation that the attorney who drafted the original protection knew Vivian was dangerous and that he was coerced into silence. Tessa's act of courage came at a high personal price. She confessed that after Halbrook left, Vivian herself had approached her in the law firm's parking lot. She told me, very quietly, that if she ever found out I had a copy of the old files, my young career would disappear like smoke, just like Halbrook's. Tessa recounted, she fled Denver shortly after, haunted by the fear of being professionally destroyed, but the guilt, the knowledge that an innocent person was being systematically erased, drew her back to help. The weight of the evidence, the silver pine tape, my financial analysis, and now Tessa's unimpeachable, original documents, was overwhelming. Malik wasted no time. He filed a sealed motion with the Colorado Bar Association against the unnamed attorneys who had facilitated the deliberate destruction of the files and the drafting of the fraudulent trusts. This was followed by a formal petition to the Denver Probate Court to reopen the Sloan Heritage Security Trust based on newly discovered evidence of fraud, professional malfeasance, and material non-disclosure of the grantor's original intent. For the first time since that terrible night Daniel left for Singapore, I felt a profound sense of hope. The evidence wasn't a magic wand. It was the product of my own strategic survival, the legal scales, so long weighted by Vivian's wealth and ruthlessness, were finally tilting back toward me. I had survived long enough for the truth, buried under a false narrative and physical terror, to finally find its way into the light. The fight was about to leave the shadows of the coffee shop and move into the arena of the courtroom. The sealed motions filed by Malik and the news of the Bar Association complaint, designed to be confidential, were not a secret for long. In the world of high-stakes Denver legal circles, information moved at the speed of malice, and within 72 hours of filing, the details had inevitably filtered back to Vivian Sloan. Her reaction was exactly as Malik had predicted. She didn't retreat or negotiate. She launched an immediate, brutal, scorched earth counteroffensive. The first blow landed where it hurt most, my professional life. I was called into the Human Resources office at Northline Insight Systems on a chilly Monday morning. The HR manager, a woman named Beverly, who usually had a pleasant, detached air, looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Lillian," she began, her voice low and formal, "we have received an anonymous report, which, given the sensitive nature of your work in data security, we must investigate thoroughly." The report, which she summarized carefully, was a mirror image of Vivian's threats at Silver Pine Lodge. It claimed I had been regularly exhibiting aggressive outbursts, was openly paranoid that family members were conspiring to harm me, and had fabricated injuries in the past to garner attention and sympathy. The report suggested I was mentally unstable and therefore a significant risk to the highly sensitive data I handled for major clients. My stomach twisted with a bitter certainty. The reports were vague, expertly crafted to use my actual trauma against me, but they were unquestionably planted by Vivian's operatives. Following protocol, Northline placed me on immediate, mandatory administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The shock was immediate and paralyzing. My income, the stability I had painstakingly built over the last 18 months, was cut off at the knees. This maneuver was brilliant in its cruelty. It simultaneously validated Vivian's narrative of me being unstable while crippling me financially right when legal costs for discovery and filing were soaring. I was facing the possibility of paying out thousands of dollars to fight the woman who had just ensured I had zero income. But Vivian wasn't just targeting my job. She was systematically poisoning every corner of my life. The campaign of disinformation spread like a virulent infection through the Sloan family's extended network. Daniel's sister, my Aunt Carol, called me from New Jersey. Her voice was strained, caught between sympathy and deeply planted doubt. "Lillian, Vivian called me. She was sobbing, saying you're obsessed with revenge, that you're accusing her of these wild things because you're consumed by jealousy over Daniel's success. She said you are not emotionally stable." I spent 45 minutes trying to calmly explain the $8 million fraud and the coercion, but the seed of doubt Vivian planted was strong. She had used the most powerful weapon in the abuser's arsenal, the plausible lie, coded in tears and the rhetoric of family division. The attempt to label me as mentally unfit quickly moved from my family to my current life. My landlord, a retired man named Mr. Peterson, called me into his office at Lena's Aurora apartment complex. "Lillian, I need to tell you about 2 calls I received yesterday and today," he said, looking genuinely concerned. "A woman called, claiming to be your psychiatric consultant. She expressed deep concern over your escalating paranoid behavior and requested access to your apartment under the guise of a welfare check. Said you might be a danger to yourself." He looked uncomfortable. I refused, of course, but she was very professional, very insistent. I pressed her for details, and honestly, the way she spoke, it sounded like she was reading from a very formal, prepared script. She even quoted a section of the Colorado Revised Statutes regarding mandatory intervention. "Do you have a psychiatric consultant, Lillian?" "No, Mr. Peterson, I don't," I stated, my voice cold. That was Vivian. She is attempting to weaponize medical privacy laws against me to gain access to my life and further discredit me. She is trying to certify me as insane so my testimony against her in court is dismissed. The attempt to have me institutionalized, which she had confessed to on the Silver Pine tape, was now an active, real-world operation. The physical threat also escalated. One night, I returned to Lena's apartment after working late on the case files at a public library. The front door, which I always checked twice, was slightly ajar, maybe open by 1 inch. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I froze in the hallway, calling Lena, who was still out with colleagues. I crept inside, flicking on the lights. Nothing was obviously broken, but the subtle signs of intrusion were everywhere. The towels in the linen closet were unfolded. The books on the shelf were shifted by mere millimeters. It was a search done by a professional who was trying not to leave heavy-handed evidence. After a terrifying 10 minutes of inspection, I realized what was missing. It wasn't my new laptop, or Lena's television, or my mother's ring. It was the original, ragged physical notebook I had kept during those initial, terrifying 3 months in my father's house. The one where I wrote down details of every verbal assault, every blow, every injury, long before I started digitizing the record. It was an irreplaceable piece of raw evidence of the initial abuse cycle. The intrusion was a violation, but it was also a confirmation. Vivian was terrified that the truth was getting out, and she had sent in a team to retrieve or destroy any physical proof linking her to the beatings. Fortunately, my strategic paranoia had paid off. I had scanned and digitized the entire notebook into the If I Disappear file before the break-in, but the breach was too close for comfort. The next day, I spent nearly $1,000 installing a discreet, high-resolution security camera system, covering both the front door and the small back entrance. I wasn't just investigating a crime anymore. I was actively defending myself. Less than a week later, the camera system provided the next piece of crucial evidence. The 4 a.m. motion sensor alert woke me. Reviewing the footage, I saw a large, stocky man in a dark jacket, trying the handle of the front door. He was testing the lock, attempting a non-violent entry, but it was the logo on his jacket that brought a cold, sick wave of clarity. The stylized globe and arrow of Frontier Meridian Logistics. Vivian wasn't just hiring lawyers. She was using her husband's own corporate resources, his security team, his influence, to harass and terrorize me. It was the ultimate weaponization of the corporate structure against a single person. I gathered all the new evidence, the anonymous HR reports, Mr. Peterson's detailed log of the fake psychiatric consultant calls, the forced administrative leave notice from Northline, the physical evidence of the break-in, and the terrifying video footage of the Frontier Meridian employee attempting to breach my apartment. I delivered the entire package to Malik. He reviewed the evidence with a grim satisfaction. "Lillian, this is no longer a civil case with a side of abuse," Malik declared, stacking the police reports and HR memos. "This is a clear textbook pattern of criminal harassment, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. When a subject responds to a legal complaint by immediately and systematically attempting to destroy the victim's livelihood, credibility, and physical safety, they are confessing guilt in the loudest way possible." Malik already had the Silver Pine tape, the Hallbrook documents, and the financial analysis. Now, he had the undeniable, recent proof of Vivian's ongoing criminal conduct. He immediately contacted the Denver District Attorney's Office, specifically the team specializing in financial crimes and complex domestic violence cases, including coercive control. He presented the case not as a family dispute, but as an ongoing criminal enterprise. The combination of the financial documentation and the recent, blatant criminal harassment was the tipping point. The DA's office, recognizing the high profile and the systematic nature of the abuse, agreed to take the case seriously. They decided to open a parallel criminal investigation into Vivian Sloan encompassing charges of domestic violence, coercive control, witness intimidation, and sophisticated financial abuse. It was the ultimate vindication. For the first time since this ordeal began, I had a powerful governmental agency, armed with the authority to issue subpoenas, freeze assets, and demand sworn testimony, standing firmly on my side. I was no longer fighting alone from Lena's couch in Aurora. I was now a protected witness in a criminal investigation. The power struggle had shifted irrevocably, and the first shot of the true war had been fired. The launch of the criminal investigation, a formal query by the District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit, changed the entire calculus of the case. Vivian's campaign of harassment ceased almost immediately, replaced by a defensive wall of silence and expensive legal maneuvering. The investigators weren't just looking at my testimony anymore. They were scrutinizing bank records, subpoenaing email exchanges, and most crucially, turning the spotlight onto Daniel Sloan and his company, Frontier Meridian Logistics. Daniel was immediately drawn into the vortex. He was served with multiple subpoenas demanding detailed corporate and personal financial documents. Vivian, sensing the disintegration of their shared front, became relentless, a constant, controlling presence. "You must present a unified defense, Daniel," she would repeat, her voice tight with cold fear, no longer the saccharine performer of the past. "You tell the DA that Lillian is unstable, that she is obsessed with destroying everything we built. We are a team. You owe me your loyalty." She reminded him of the contracts she had pushed him to sign. the deals she had strategically positioned, reinforcing the idea that without her aggressive guidance, he would be nothing. The Financial Crimes Unit, with the power of the state behind them, quickly uncovered the pattern I had only glimpsed. They found a series of highly suspicious payments flowing out of Frontier Meridian's operating accounts. These were large sums, sometimes reaching $50,000 in a single transaction, labeled ambiguously as consulting fees or vendor management costs. The recipients were the shell entities I had identified: Red Ridge Vista Holdings and Harborline Ridge Investments, the corporations solely controlled by Vivian. The DA's analysts confirmed that no tangible services were ever rendered. This was not merely financial abuse, it was systematic embezzlement. Vivian had been using her position as Daniel's confidant and the signatory on his accounts to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars from his company, routing the funds through her shell companies before placing them into assets she alone controlled. The abuse wasn't just to steal my legacy, it was to strip Daniel's business, making her the central financial pillar of their marriage. The Mountain recording was the human face of the fraud. The DA's office produced a meticulous transcript, highlighting the most damning admissions. They underlined the sentences where Vivian coldly admitted to shaping me with physical violence and her explicit threat to drown you in official paperwork, and certify me as mentally unstable to silence the financial claims. This transcript was not just evidence of domestic battery, it was conclusive proof of witness intimidation and criminal intent to obstruct justice by coercion. The pressure on Daniel became intolerable. He was summoned for a formal deposition, alone, without the protective presence of Vivian or Grant Mercer. The prosecutor, Marissa Cole, started slowly, focusing on the Frontier Meridian accounts. Daniel, initially stiff and evasive, held firm to Vivian's narrative of efficient tax planning. Then, Marissa shifted gears. She placed the documents from Tessa's USB in front of him. The original Sloan Heritage Security Trust from 12 years ago, signed by him. Next to it, Halbrook's internal memo expressing deep suspicion of abuse and coercion. And finally, a timeline of legal bill payments from Vivian's personal account to the security firm hired to manage the archival fire. Daniel stared at the papers. The careful layers of denial he had constructed over 3 years began to peel away. The color drained from his face as he read Halbrook's memo. He saw his own signature on the original, protective document, juxtaposed with proof that the attorney who created that protection was silenced when Vivian started to rewrite it. Marissa Cole leaned across the table. "Mr. Sloan, your corporate accounts show you were making a presentation in Dubai on October 4th, 2 years ago. The records show you signed an amended trust document that day, faxed from Denver, and the security company that initiated the archival fire was paid on October 5th, the day after you signed. Does the timeline you believed, the story of efficient estate management, still seem plausible now?" Daniel looked like a man drowning. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He saw the cold, indisputable pattern of betrayal. He realized he hadn't just ignored my pain. He had been a manipulated co-signer in the destruction of my future and the embezzlement of his own company's funds. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the phone rang on Lena's kitchen counter. The caller ID was Daniel's private mobile number. I walked to the quietest corner of the apartment, taking a deep breath before answering. His voice was a strained, shaky whisper, defeated and utterly drained of the confidence that had defined him for 60 years. "Lillian," he began, his voice cracking. "I saw the papers today, at the DA's office, the original trust, Halbrook's notes." A long, agonizing silence stretched between us, filled only with his ragged breathing. "I need to ask you, daughter, was it like that every single time I went on a trip? From the beginning? Did she just start right away?" His question wasn't framed as an accusation, but as a horrified plea for confirmation. He wasn't asking for my forgiveness. He was finally asking for the truth. I steeled myself. I was no longer the little girl who softened the edges of reality to protect her father's ego. "Yes, Dad," I stated flatly. keeping my voice level and professional, using the same factual tone I used with Malik. It was like that every time you left. It started the moment the door closed, and it only stopped because I managed to escape 21 months ago. Your business trips were her opportunity, and my isolation was her control. I hung up without another word. The silence that followed was heavy with finality. Vivienne discovered the call. She must have seen the number in the call history, or perhaps Daniel was simply incapable of hiding his guilt and despair. The ensuing explosion was not subtle. Later, neighbors would testify to the sustained screaming that emanated from the Sloan residence that night. Vivienne, in a terrifying fit of rage, smashed a framed wedding photo against the marble fireplace, the sound echoing through the house. "You ungrateful fool!" she screamed, her voice reaching a high, piercing pitch that transcended the glass shattering. "After everything I did to protect you, to make you look like a successful man, without me pushing you to sign those contracts, without me handling the messy details, you'd be sitting in a mid-level manager's cubicle. You owe me your loyalty. You will tell them she is crazy. You will tell them she is lying." Their fight became the final, accidental piece of evidence, providing independent witnesses to Vivienne's controlling, aggressive, and abusive behavior when her carefully constructed facade collapsed. The day before the first major pretrial hearing, Grant Mercer, Vivienne's attorney, arranged a closed-door meeting with Malik and Marissa Cole. It was the moment of capitulation, where the defense attempts to buy their way out of a guaranteed criminal conviction. Mercer was slick and confident. Despite the overwhelming evidence, "Ms. Sloan is deeply saddened by the emotional damage this messy family dispute has caused. She is prepared to offer a substantial civil settlement, a figure in the range of $1.5 million, to be paid to Lillian Martin immediately. In exchange, Ms. Martin must agree to drop her civil suit against the trust and, most importantly, must decline to cooperate with the district attorney's criminal investigation, agreeing not to pursue the alleged misunderstandings of domestic violence." The money was staggering. It would instantly pay off my student loans, secure my financial future, and provide a huge cushion for my legal expenses. It was enough to completely buy my silence and my freedom. I looked at Malik. He simply raised an eyebrow, waiting for my cue. "No," I stated clearly, firmly. My voice resonated in the silence of the conference room. "Tell Mr. Mercer that this is not about money, not anymore. I already have all the evidence I need to reclaim my trust fund and my assets. This is about preventing Vivienne Sloan from ever doing this to another person, whether it's a future stepchild, a business partner, or a vulnerable elderly client. The price of that protection is not $1.5 million. It is a criminal conviction. We decline the offer." The next morning was the culmination of everything. I was sitting in Malik's office when the news came through. Daniel Sloan walked into the Denver District Attorney's office building at 8:30 a.m. He was alone, no Grant Mercer, no Vivienne. He presented himself to Marissa Cole's team and offered a full sworn affidavit. He confirmed that he had knowingly, though under intense emotional duress from his wife, signed corporate documents without due diligence. He confirmed that Vivienne had encouraged him to believe my accounts of the abuse were hysterical lies. He confessed to his own willful blindness and his enabling role in the fraud. He offered to fully cooperate with the criminal investigation in exchange for consideration of leniency in his own potential criminal liability related to the corporate embezzlement. He had finally, irrevocably, chosen his daughter over his wife. He had chosen the difficult truth over the comfortable lie, but as the case would proceed, it was a choice made far too late to absolve him of the debt he owed, and one that ensured both he and Vivienne would face the consequences of the systematic destruction of the Sloan family name. The courtroom in Denver felt exactly as I remembered it from that first terrible visit, but this time, the cold air and heavy oak paneling didn't oppress me. They focused me. This was the arena where the truth, armed with documents and recordings, would finally dismantle the lie. When my name was called, I walked to the witness stand. I was no longer Lillian, the fragile victim hiding in her father's study. I was Lillian Martin, data security analyst and primary witness for the prosecution. I spoke calmly, systematically, recounting the events not as emotional trauma but as a criminal timeline. I described the deliberate isolation, the specific nights Daniel was away on his frontier meridian trips, when the verbal and physical abuse would begin. The exact moment I realized the documents had been altered, and my subsequent investigation into the financial shell companies. I recounted the terrifying night the crystal candelabra shattered, missing my head by an inch. Grant Mercer, Vivian's lead defense attorney, rose to cross-examine. He was impeccably dressed, smooth, and utterly ruthless. His strategy was simple: discredit the witness. Ms. Martin, you admit you are suing the defendant for millions of dollars, correct? I am moving to restore my rights to a trust fund that was illegally stripped from me, I corrected, my voice steady. And you admit you were put on administrative leave from your job at Northline Insight Systems due to reports of aggression and paranoid behavior. Isn't that true? He pressed, attempting to paint me as the villain. I was put on leave after an anonymous report was filed 1 week after we filed a civil suit against the defendant, I countered. A report that mirrored threats the defendant made against me. The prosecutor, Marissa Cole, stepped up for redirect. She introduced the analysis that linked the anonymous reports to email accounts associated with the shell companies Red Ridge Vista and Harborline Ridge. The evidence was overwhelming. The character assassination was part of the crime, not evidence of my instability. Then came the audio. The clerk played the full 87-minute recording from Silver Pine Lodge. The courtroom fell silent. Vivian's voice, clear and chilling, filled the air, moving from the soft, fake concern to the explosive fury. The jury heard her admit to the few minor hits to keep me compliant, and most damningly, her explicit threat. I will drown you in official paperwork, and you will be certified as mentally unstable. Vivian, seated at the defense table, finally cracked. Her composure dissolved. She clenched her jaw, her face pale, and violently shook her head when the recording played the explicit threat, a silent but palpable confirmation of her desperate guilt. Next, Tessa, Hal Brooks' former assistant, took the stand. Nervous but resolute, she detailed the orchestrated archival fire, the fear Halbrook felt, and the threat Vivian issued to her personally in the parking lot. She authenticated the USB drive and the original trust files. A forensic accountant followed, presenting simplified charts. With dry professional certainty, he showed the jury the money flow, how Daniel's bonus money was immediately rerouted through 3 shell companies with no legitimate business activity, creating a $500,000 annual personal slush fund for Vivian, all masked under Daniel's signature. The prosecutor then delivered the final, devastating legal blow, the introduction of Halbrook's internal memo, which detailed his deep suspicion of financial abuse against Ms. Martin, and the original trust document containing Section 3, Clause D, the clause stating that any beneficiary engaging in coercive control or violence would automatically forfeit their claim. The trust wasn't just protective, it was prophetic. Vivian's own violence was the key that unlocked her immediate financial ruin. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating when Daniel Sloan was called to the stand. He was gaunt and broken, utterly stripped of his former corporate confidence. He looked every bit of his 60-something years. He didn't make it 2 minutes before he started to weep. He confessed his criminal negligence, his wholesale reliance on Vivian, his refusal to read the financial documents, and his deliberate decision to ignore the desperate, subtle calls for help from his own daughter. "I chose the easy story," he choked out, wiping tears from his eyes. "I chose to believe that Lillian was high-strung, that she was overreacting. It was easier to believe her mother was right and that Lillian was lying, than to face the fact that the woman I lived with was systematically destroying my child." In a heavy moment of silence, Daniel looked directly at me. It was not the casual glance of a man worried about his reputation, but the desperate, naked gaze of a father facing his failure. "Lillian, I am so sorry. Not for the money. I am sorry that I left you alone in that house. with a woman I gave all the power to, while I was chasing titles and deals 7,000 miles away. I should have been here. The emotional impact was profound. Daniel's confession confirmed every single detail of my experience: the isolation, the coercion, and the terrible, shared blindness that allowed Vivian's terror to flourish. Vivian was recalled to the stand for a brief, final rebuttal. Under cross-examination by Marissa Cole, the mask she had managed to hold on for the last 2 hours finally slipped. When pressed about the financial transfers, her veneer of calm professionalism crumbled. She spat out her contempt, referring to Daniel as a useless fool and dismissing me as an ungrateful, weak child who was only motivated by money. The jury saw, raw and immediate, the exact same cruel, controlling person whose voice they had heard on the audio recording. In the closing arguments, Marissa Cole delivered a concise, brutal summary. This was not a domestic squabble. It was a calculated, 3-year criminal campaign. Vivian Sloan used her husband's trust and her position as his wife to commit theft, not just of money, but of a person's identity and safety. She used financial control and physical violence to crush an adult child who stood in the way of her greed. She used her corporate influence to weaponize the system against her stepdaughter when she fought back. This court must send a message that financial abuse and coercive control are not merely family matters. They are serious crimes that destroy lives. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The foreman returned the verdict: guilty. Vivian Sloan was convicted on multiple counts, including aggravated battery, domestic violence based on coercive control, and financial exploitation. The civil judgment was clear and immediate. The original Sloan Heritage Security Trust was reinstated. My claim to all assets was restored, and all funds transferred to Vivian's shell companies were ordered seized and returned to the trust. As the judge formally read the sentence, ordering Vivian immediately taken into custody and detailing the massive restitution payments, I walked out of the Denver courthouse. The Colorado air was sharp and cold, a perfect clean sweep. There was no triumphant shout, no Hollywood embrace with Lena or Malik, just a massive, profound lightness. The woman who had sworn to beat me into submission and erase me from my own life would never again have the power to step on the same street I was walking on. The story was over. Thank you so much for listening to Lillian's incredible story of survival and strategic revenge. I want to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on this final twist. Don't forget to subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories, smash that like button, and hit the hype button to make sure this video reaches even more people.